Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Altispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. The phone lines are open this hour. To be a part of the program, it is a free call, 1-855-450-NOAH. That's 1-855-450-6624, or send an email to live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host. Delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah show kicks off this hour. Joining me, my co-host, Mr. Steve Ovens. Welcome in, sir.
Good evening, Noah. I've been having my arms deep in some technical guts of physical computers and software, and I thought it might be interesting to chat about that.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait. You know what's exciting to me when you get your arms deep into physical and software computing is we know that the challenges are going to be above that of us of mere mortals.
I wouldn't say that. I get a little carried away. I'd say that's fair.
All right. Well, I'm excited to hear that. Before we get to your escapades, it's cool if we answer some questions from those who ask it.
Absolutely.
Our first email comes in from Craig. Craig writes in and says, "Hello. When it comes to AI, one of the first things that comes to mind for me is Skynet from Terminator 2. With that being said, and with open source forms of AI, would it be okay to dabble in? What would you recommend to just learn with? I don't have a personal or work need for AI, but I want to know what to watch out for, or maybe to learn something new or open source, of course. Take care, Craig." So let's start. So let me back up and give some frame of reference here. When we were at Red Hat Summit this year, every person that we interviewed, one of the things we asked was, tell me what open source AI is. Define it for me. How would you explain it? And you know what? That's a difficult thing to do. And it turns out there isn't one shared definition of this is what open source AI means, because you can open source the software, but you need the models, and you can give the training models, but then do you give the training model data away? And is that even useful? And can somebody do? So anyway, there's a whole bunch of questions, and none of it is very well defined yet. We're all still kind of figuring it out. Now, the one thing that was consistent from Red Hat is the more open source, the better. It sounds like that's the road that Craig is on. So we're going to point you in a couple of different directions. One is our very own executive producer, JT, did a talk at Self, actually did a couple of them. We'll have those linked in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com. Continuing off of that is a Matrix room. You can learn more at #theartificialdominion:matrix.org. And you can join the chat. It's continuing 24/7, 365 days a year. They talk about AI in there. So if you're wanting to get immediately plugged in or ask some questions or get started, that's a pretty good way to go. Steve, on top of that, what would you recommend if somebody came to you and said, "Steve, I want to get started with AI and I don't know where to begin," in that voice?
I would say you need to know what type of AI you want to learn about. Here's a bunch of textbooks to go learn. No, I'm kidding. But I would ask
RTFM, I'm an old crotchety man.
No, not necessarily, but like, how do I help you? Because that's like saying, I want to learn about computers. What do I do? Right? AI is a big topic, and it kind of breaks down into, colloquially, we say AI, and most people are thinking about large language models and being able to do like chatting with them, right? However, there's all kinds of AI out there that does all kinds of different things, and so it really depends on what are you looking to learn. With that in mind, I assume you're going to be doing something with some sort of text input, because most people aren't looking for, if you know that you're looking for an AI, for example, to generate audio or to do transcription or something like that, you probably will specifically ask about that. So I'm going to assume that you're looking for something that you can chat to, or something that can help you program, or one of those types of tasks. Those are the most common. For that, I would say that you could go down the route that I did. I'm not sure that I recommend that, which is go and learn about the models and all that sort of stuff. If you just want to play around, there's something called LM Studio. And what I really like about this is it gives you a nice graphical UI to go and pick a curated list of some of what the author feels as the best models out there that are open source. And so it's available for all your operating systems. It's meant to run on your local system because it's got a UI, so you can't run it remotely. But it makes it really easy. You pick your model and you pick go, and then you do some typing. Like it is kind of that simple, and it will help you out, and that'll get your feet wet. And in a similar vein, there's also something called GPT for All. That's a little more complicated to set up, whereas the LM Studio, I believe, is just it's an app image. So it literally is download and double click and you're off to the races. So I would start there. And if you're interested in more, the artificial Dominion is definitely a good place to go. I ask my up-to-date questions in there or directly to JT because I have the bat phone. But yeah, that's what I would do.
So let me ask you this. Do you have a suggestion if anybody is looking for image generation? So let's say you're doing an art project, or maybe you're doing a video project and you want, a super customized splash screen to put up on YouTube, something like that. Do you have a recommendation for people to get started there?
So those are more tricky because if you're self-hosting them, it's honestly going to generate a lot of porn. I have tried a lot of these things. Like, to the point where I'm being very explicit, like, put clothes on. I want no, and then using negative prompts like nudity and skin and stuff like that. And you still get very questionable things. This was definitely, let's say, male centric, designed at first. And so I have yet to find a good, safe for work model, because while lots of these things will have a safe for work flag, they just blur out the image. It doesn't prevent it from generating it. It just doesn't show it to you until you do something to unblur the image. So
why is that? What I mean by that is why? Okay, so you know what? Gangriff in the chat room says glue cheese, and I think this is the answer you're going to give me. But why is it that it's so centric around explicit material rather than, even if I'm not asking for that? In fact, if I'm telling it directly, don't do that, please.
Because that's what it got trained on, or that's the leaning for it. A lot of these things are focused on specific types of art, even the realistic ones. I had a heck of a time getting it to give me something. I actually gave up, honestly. So producer JT is definitely a better person to ask about getting the prompts right and potentially safe for work models. But I found that a slog. I would say if you're really interested in that, the projects that have a backing by a company are more likely to be safe for work, but it also means that you're probably signing up for their service by at least giving them data of some sort.
Gangriff in the Geek Lab says glue cheese. Can you tell me the story about glue cheese and why that and what that means for AI?
Yeah, well, so that basically came from the fact of someone asked an AI, I believe it was someone asked Gemini. Now I could be mistaken, but Gemini tends to be at the heart of most of these gaffes. My cheese keeps falling off of my pizza. What can I do to fix that? And the AI suggested adding glue to make sure that the cheese stayed on the pizza. And there are other things like people were saying, what do I do to pass kidney stones? And the AI recommended at least 2 cups of urine a day to drink. And there's all kinds of these.
So hold on. So if we can go back to the glue cheese for a second. So the AI comes out with this. The internet makes fun of it and posts the answers. What does the AI take away from us making fun of the AI and its glue cheese answer?
That it weights that more heavily because it is ranked more heavily in the discussion. So the way that these things are often happen is it's based on a series of weights, like how many people are responding to it, how many times has it been posted on the internet, that sort of thing. Because at least currently, I don't believe we've been successful in training AI on humor. And so it's really hard for it to sort out whether this is actually a valid reaction or not.
Aaron Rainbolt in the chat room says, not sure what prompts you were using, but I've never run into a not safe for work image generated on accident with Stable Diffusion. Now he says he was using an NVIDIA 1050 Ti, so it was slow. and it was using a low memory variant. So maybe if you self-hosted Stable Diffusion, you could potentially get away from some of the more, nasty stuff.
Yeah, it's possible. So Stable Diffusion is one that I've specifically kind of veered away from because they started injecting their opinion into the Stable Diffusion model. As it got more popular, it got more choosy as to how it would respond to you. And so I was specifically looking for things that are not going to get in your way. Like don't give me a morality filter. Which it sounds like a weird thing when you're saying don't give me nudity, but like I don't want you to make a judgment about the thing that I'm asking you. You should just do what I'm asking you to do, right? And so apparently you can't have both.
Our second email comes in. This is a bit long, so I'm going to shut down your attention span, but hang with me. Yasin writes in and says, "Hello there. I'd like to share my opinion about self-hosted email servers. I've been operating a corporate email server at my current job since 2015. It has around 1,000 mailboxes. It's a shame I don't have any metrics to share. Metrics? Who needs them? But most of the time, the server runs along nicely, like a nice cat purring in its sleep. The real action is when you get pwned. It's happened 5 or 6 times in 9 years, and each time you have to halt the server, banish the rogue user account to the shadow realm, and then purge the spammy mess. Then comes the ritual of begging Spamhaus for mercy and a clean slate. Sometimes it's the DNS. It's always DNS, right? One fine day, our DNS servers got pwned too, and so they joined the dark side. An ISP's security service blacklisted us, so we couldn't get our mail server reached from their users, because the name resolution simply didn't work. I had to call social engineering my way to C-rank employees at said ISP, pleading for our digital redemption. Then there was the epic duel of Microsoft's Outlook servers, armed with the most stubborn DNS cache in existence. They refused to acknowledge our new IP, clinging to the old one like a bad ex. We couldn't get any email from Outlook for months. I suspect the DNS blacklist was playing dirty tricks over there too. I had to give up until it started working again. But wait, there's more. Our very own firewall, bless its Shorewall heart, decided to bug out and wage a silent war against Gmail. After weeks of banging my head against the wall, I discovered the bug thanks to a few wizards on the Shorewall developer mailing list who gave a workaround solution, and that fixed the problem. In conclusion, despite these digital skirmishes, the email service generally works fine. Sure, we face a few hours or days of chaos every other leap year, but that's just part of the adventure. Who needs a stress-free job anyway? Best, you see. So, Steve, we've had an ongoing discussion, and I've said I've couched it this way. I'm not in the boat of self-hosted email yet, but I'm also not firmly on the dock of hand it off to somebody else. I kind of have one foot in the boat, and I'm trying to see if the boat's going to sink or if I can jump in. And when I read the story, I'm not really sure what to make of it. It's framed in the reference of like, hey, this is a good idea, and you should possibly do this, but it's filled with all of these things that I don't want to do that. That sounds terrible, Steve. I don't want to do that at all.
Yeah, I thought, so first of all, hats off for writing this in a very entertaining way.
Agreed.
After our chat about AI, I thought, I wonder, did he just give it some bullet points and then ask it to write it? Because like, this is pretty clever. I did enjoy reading this off the air. Yeah, I don't know. There's a bunch of things that when you look back at it, you're like, it wasn't that bad. But when you're in the thick of it, it's terrible. And you're like, I'm never doing this again. Yeah.
And the other thing is, I don't like feeling helpless, right? And there's numerous points in this story where I feel like he's helpless and doesn't have a clear path to success. And if you're the guy that has to sit in the C-suite and go talk to somebody and explain to them when, or more importantly, when not, their thing is going to be back up, I get a little, I don't know. It just makes me uncomfortable.
Gun shy. The word you're looking for is gun shy.
Yeah, that's a good word. I like that. Our third email comes in from Dan. Dan writes in and says, Mr. Chalaya and Mr. Ovens. Very long time listener, first time caller. It's wonderful to finally have a question that I need your expertise in. Question 1, home security. I'm brand new to home security. And over the course of listening to your shows, I've heard you and Mr. Ovens discuss your home security and automation setup. I like the idea of self-hosting and applicing as many things as possible, like Mr. Ovens. Is there a turnkey way of having CCTV security system, so no Wi-Fi cameras, just hard lines routed to a DVR, and then routed to a router? Lots of routing, I know. Available for remote viewing like Eufy or SimpliSafe. I want to own my own data. So before we move on to question 2, let's start with question 1. Steve, what would you recommend if somebody said, Steve, I want cameras and I want them to be as like friendly like I would have with an Eufy or a SimpliSafe, but without having Eufy and SimpliSafe have access to all my stuff?
Yeah, so the only way that you're going to get around this really is having some sort of VPN back into your house where you can access it. If you want to own your data, it's got to sit on your servers or server. That's pretty much it. There's lots of ways to skin that cat. You don't specifically need to do a VPN, but the only other option that you have for this sort of stuff is when you have an application that's sitting on your LAN that tunnels out to a third party, let's call it arbiter, so that your phone would talk to the arbiter and the arbiter connects you to that third party client.
And just kind of brokers that connection.
Yeah, exactly. So that sort of thing is out there. But it's not very popular because they mostly, these companies would like to sell you storage, right? They sell you the hardware and then they want to sell you the storage. So you give up that convenience of connecting over the internet to a thing that you didn't have to do anything for, right? It essentially punches through your carrier grade NAT or whatever you have and gets the information to your phone. They do that for you in exchange for your data, generally speaking.
So exactly what Steve is talking about, one example of what you can do. So we install professionally at Altispeed, we install Synology NVRs. And a big reason why we do that is all of the data is stored on the Synology. So you buy it, you plug it in, you turn it on, you install Surveillance Station, which is a free app available on the Synology. You can use any camera you want to use as long as it is ONVIF compliant. And then you have a couple of options. So option 1, like Steve said, you can use a VPN, which means, and you could do that a couple different ways, right? You could use like an open VPN thing where you have a client where you turn it on, turn it off, or add the cert into your phone so it automatically connects. That's one way. Another way is you could use something like a WireGuard or a Tailscale that connects in the background and spins up the tunnel when you need it. The third way, and quite honestly the most popular way, even though there are some security implications here, you can punch a hole in your firewall. So the way that works for a lot of our clients, they have a little DDNS client that runs and it updates a domain that we host for them. And so we run a little, basically almost like a DNS server that publishes a custom domain for them that reroutes them back to their public IP address. And if their public IP address changes, that entry is updated almost instantaneously. And so then in their client, they put in their custom address that we give them, and then they can sign in. If that sounds complicated or cumbersome to you, and you missed the part where I said I wanted to be like SimpliSafe or I wanted it to be like Eufy. I want to plug it in. I want to use it. No, sign up for a cloud thing. I just don't want the data stored there. Well, Synology does have a cloud version that you can use where it will do what Steve was talking about. They have a server. It brokers the connection, signs you in, and gets you access to your thing. Now, the important thing to acknowledge there is, in theory, it's just brokering the connection and you've got a direct connection. I haven't seen this. I don't know about you, Steve. I haven't seen the source code from Synology, so I have no idea what it's doing when you sign into the cloud account and tying your NVR to the thing. I assume it's just brokering the connection, but can I tell you for certain that they're not offloading all of your recordings or that nobody has access to it? I can't tell you that. In fact, Eufy specifically told people that their recordings were local on their device, and it turned out the thumbnails were being proxied through their servers and were available to a bunch of people. So if it's a real security concern, I caution you and implore you in the strongest possible terms, don't use the little cloud thing from Synology. Set up a firewall, set up a VPN, do something of the sort. But if you're looking for a one-to-one thing where you want all of the recordings to be on your home, but you want all of the advantages of being able to do, sign into one place and everything, quote unquote, just works, the options are out there. They exist. I don't like them for one reason or the other. I prefer to know what's coming in and out of my network. And that means punching holes intentionally or creating a proper front door via a VPN.
Yeah. So I have 2 comments on that. So number 1, the not knowing what's happening with the applications. This was a little while ago, but a well-known application was actually brokering connection for you, as it should be, but also taking MD5 sums or some sort of hash of your local files and uploading them, and then using those for anti-piracy or other type activities based on comparing them with other things.
It's great.
So
it's good. That's what I want.
Just toss that out there. As for the punching a hole in the firewall, that gives me the willies to the point where I didn't even consider it, right? There's exactly one application that I do that for, and that's Nextcloud, because Nextcloud was designed from the bottom up to be on the internet and be a cloud thing.
Yes.
I trust them to do that. I do not trust random appliance maker. Like, I don't even trust, the off-the-shelf router people, because they do things like embed the password that you can't change, or leave the debug port on. Like, they do all kinds of ridiculous things. So no, I would not do that.
I can't remember who it was, but it was a Red Hatter. I'm not gonna be able to think of who it was, but anyway, he told me straight up, if you expose a thing directly to the internet in this day and age, you're a fool. Like, putting something on the wide open internet, not behind a firewall, not behind any sort, like, you're a fool. So it isn't the best security practice, but I will also tell you, if I'm comparing best practices and what doesn't give Steve the willies, which is absolutely something I consider when I'm putting anything into production. If I'm putting that in one column, the other column is what people expect. And when I get down to the average home user, most of them won't settle for, all you have to do is install this client, or all you have to do is pair your phone. They just want to be able to sign in and use the thing. And there are two ways to get there. One is use the built-in cloud thing, which I hate. Well, here's a question for you, Steve. Given the choice between signing into the cloudy thing, which God only knows what it's doing, or punching a hole in the firewall, which of those two admittedly bad options are you less scared of?
Is this my own stuff? Because that nullifies this argument completely.
Well, if you have somebody that's like, my choices are A or B, I'm picking A or B. Without your decision, I'm using both A and B, so it'll be the worst of both worlds. How's that if I was trying to stack a question?
You're a reasoning adult. Have fun.
Okay, so between those two, I'm going to tell you punch the hole, because at least you know what you're doing, and at least you know where to look for the security threat. If you're using the little broker thing, I can't even tell you for sure what it's doing. And so I would be asking myself, what is it doing? And so I would be telling you to ask what you're doing. So anyway, those are some things I would consider as far as getting home security up and running. Now, he has a second question in here. And question number 2 is about home calendaring. My Wonder Wife is a logistical support genius. She manages to schedule our busy homeschooling family around all of the activities. See the caveat below. She does all of this on a dry erase. Oh my gosh. Steve, I'm getting a compulsive eye twitch. She does all of this on a dry erase calendar and a paper planner. Ugh, hard copy. I do all of my planning digitally in Proton Calendar. I'd like to create a digital appliance like DACboard, but that can set up seem difficult. And a paid subscription, last time I checked, are there other options? Conclusion, normally I'd say, I don't know where to get this information, but that's not true in this instance, because I know exactly where to go. I go to the people at the Ask Noah show. Thanks for your nearly 2 decades on the air helping people with open source gracefully, Dan. Okay, so Steve, you and I both use Proton Mail, but if I remember right, you're using Nextcloud for your calendaring. You're not using Proton for that, right?
Correct. For years I've been using it was OwnCloud before Nextcloud in terms of how long I've been using the calendaring for.
So let me tell you why you shouldn't use Proton, and then you tell me why you do use Nextcloud. So Proton calendaring, I'll be honest with you, I started using it because it wasn't Google, and my wife and I, we signed up for a family plan for Proton because we wanted to support the great work that Proton is doing, and the calendaring was built in, and so it was just an easy thing. Oh, by the way, when she sends an invite, it comes to my Proton mail address, which I only use for personal stuff, and so it just worked out really well. Here's the ginormous, in my opinion, blind sight in the Proton calendar system. There are 2 modes in which the calendar can operate. One is the encrypted mode that you would expect from a company like Proton, in which all the events are encrypted and the invitations are encrypted, everything's encrypted and is private and all the things. If you don't want to do that, your only option is to create a share link, in which case anybody that has the link can see the can see the calendar. Yeah. So, and there's nothing in between. And so, whereas every other system has granular permission schemes, that is to say, okay, to throw Proton Calendar a bone. I do believe they support iCal, and I do believe you can set it to either show me the events or just show me busy or available. So, I mean, there's a little bit of granularity in there, but nowhere near what you get from Nextcloud. Now, Nextcloud is a full-in, drop-in G Suite or Outlook replacement. Steve, how does Nextcloud Calendar work?
We use CalDAV and connect via our individual users on Nextcloud, and she's on iOS and I'm on Android, and it also integrates with the Linux desktop calendar, all of which super useful. And we just use a shared calendar.
So to be clear, when you're setting your calendar up, you add it to whatever native calendar application you want to use. And CalDAV does all the magic, synchronizes everything in the background. It all shows up in Proton. There's no link that if it were to get out, everybody can see your events. And yet all the things, no matter what device you're using, they all sync back to the calendar. So as it relates to Dan's question, if he wants to put a big, like a board up of sorts in his house and he wants to tie it to a calendar, there's no good way to do that with Proton Calendar unless you just want to be able to see the events, which isn't going to be terribly helpful. If he wants to do this, he needs to be able to have some sort of I'm envisioning some sort of a touchscreen interface that he can tap on the thing and create an event. Nextcloud is perfectly suited for this.
I mean, I think it works well. Here's the other thing. You can integrate it with Home Assistant and the Home Assistant calendar as well. So that I know that the JB people, they do a shot every time that they say NixOS. I think we should do one every time we talk about Home Assistant. But
we don't drink when we do the show, though. So that'll be a problem. What would we shoot?
That's fair. I don't know. Energy drink? I'm not sure. But
might be worse than alcohol.
It could be interesting. I actually use the calendar for a different calendar inside of Home Assistant for automation around the house, and it alerts my wife to when I might actually have meetings and stuff like that, so she can actually see what's happening on a daily basis for me. And so I love the Nextcloud calendaring, and I would see no reason why you wouldn't just put the calendar up on, leave the calendar page up on a touchscreen device if you chose to. But because it's so composable, you could find an open source calendaring app that you like that is comparable to DAC. I think it's called what was it
DACboard?
called? DACboard. So yeah, that's where I would go.
Dan has a caveat. He said, despite the 1990s stigma of the maladjusted awkward teens, my ladies enjoy competitive gymnastics, jiu-jitsu, American Heritage Girls, faith-based scouting programs, ninja class, parkour on roids, range days with dad, horseback riding, not that UK crap, bushcraft skills. They speak like adults. They are grounded Christian ladies. P.S. I'm glad you got your own show. I know it's been a minute, but I wanted to tell you that I've always thought you were the best of JBs, and when you got Steve on too, it's my favorite Linux podcast ever. God bless you and your whole family. Keep witnessing to Steve. So I think it's probably necessary to point out here. I feel like both Steve and I are both believers. So iron sharpens iron. So I guess we can continue to co-witness to each other.
Yeah, I was commenting to our producer today where spelling and comma makes a big difference in this case, because it could have been keep witnessing to Steve, as well, and wasn't quite sure what the intent there was.
Yeah, have to have an extra O. Anyway, we appreciate you writing in, Dan, and hopefully that gets you started. I will tell you, if I had it to do over again, I would have done Nextcloud Calendar over Proton Calendar. Our fourth email comes in from Hank. Oh gosh. I cringe when you compare the cost benefit between Hobo Freight and Snap-on. Back in the late 70s, I earned a living as a mechanic before we had technicians. As such, I'm very familiar with Snap-on. The prices are very high, and here's what you get for that premium. 1, quality tools. 2, a good guarantee. 3, Snap-on truck stops shop weekly, so you get whatever you need. 4, Snap-on dealer will provide credit, allowing you to make payments. Over time, without any extra charge, at least they did back then, those two costs that retail channel a lot that they would need to cover that cost, the price of the tools. At the time, my go-to was Sears, long before they shifted. One day I mentioned to my Snap-on dealer how many multiples of price the Snap-on box and wrenches were compared to Craftsman. Each point was mentioned was matched, including the triple chrome plating, lifetime guarantee. even a slight chamber on the edge of the box. I would not spend $1,000 for a Snap-on jack. I might go to an auto repair-oriented Reddit or other forum and say, my HF jack failed, so I'm going to replace it with a Snap-on. And there'll be somebody telling you you're wrong, you're an idiot. And if you do that, you can get the same jack for X brand and save yourself the money. Best, Hank. So a couple of things. So I think it was my father-in-law, for a time being, worked as a mechanic, had all Snap-on tools. They were American made. He loved them. A good friend of mine that I went to high school with and still keep in contact to this day, is an auto mechanic, and he buys all Snap-on stuff, and he too would tell you that the benefit there is that the truck comes right to his shop, and so when he needs a thing, he walks over to him and goes, it broke, or I need this, and they go, okay, here you go. And they actually, his dealership has it worked out to where if he buys a $1,000 tool or a $2,000 tool, they just take $100 or $200 out of his paycheck and then put it towards the Snap-on stuff. And so it allows them to impulse buy a little bit more, both from the standpoint of breaking up the purchase, but also it kind of smooths it over with the better half, because she doesn't see it necessarily coming out of the paycheck. So I get what you're saying, and I don't question for a moment that if you're a mechanic and you live, eat, and breathe on your tools, that buy good tools, 100%. In fact, if Kenny were back here talking about it and we were talking about IT tools, we could do a whole episode on the best IT tools that we found. There's a crimper, Ethernet crimper, that they don't make anymore, and all the guys that work at Altispeed go on eBay and buy this crimper because it's so good and it's just better than anything out there. So I mean, for sure, when you live and eat and breathe the tool, buy them once, take good care of them, they'll take good care of you the rest of your life. I think where Harbor Freight, and I'm going to continue to make the argument, even though I'm failing drastically at it, and Steve is not saying a word and he's winning, I still think there's an argument to be made. Sometimes good enough is good enough. Our fifth email comes in from Jaden. Jaden says, I just listened to episode 401. In the episode, you say that the only Android alternatives are Lineage and Graphene OS. I wanted to ask if you've ever looked into EOS, otherwise known as Murna. It's based on Lineage, and I'm also curious why you didn't include Sailfish, seeing how you've tested it before. Jaden. So I'll go backwards. As to why I didn't mention Sailfish OS, it's the same reason I don't mention Ubuntu, or I'm trying to think of some other ones, KDE Mobile. They're good. They function, they work, and if you know what you're doing or you can live without a couple of things, it's a great way to go. The problem is if you're coming into it with if you're coming off of an iPhone, or you're coming off of a Samsung Android phone, and you step into the Sailfish world, I will tell you straight up, I think Sailfish has the best mobile UI I've ever used. Their little tutorial, they walk you through everything. It changes I don't know what you'd even call it, the color hue based on the theme that you pick. I mean, it is an absolutely gorgeous operating system that they have the UI dialed down to a fine science. The only thing that even comes close to being as good as Sailfish OS is the Web OS from Palm before they turned it into like a TV operating system. Absolutely stellar operating system, Sailfish. The problem is, you go to buy it. First of all, you can't buy it in the US, so you got to pretend that you're in the UK, and you got to come up with a UK address and get a VPN and do all that dance to just buy the thing, because it's licensed. They don't just give it away. The second problem is there's a fairly limited amount of devices that it will run on. The Sony Xperias, I've had the best luck with those. And the biggest thing, you're basically stuck in a third-party environment, and so you're dealing with third-party apps for everything. And so the most notable thing, and actually the thing that both took me off of Sailfish and Signal at the same time, there is no Signal. There is no Signal app for Sailfish. And only in the past few years did they come out with the Matrix client for Sailfish. So there are downsides. Now, the flip side to that is it nice to be able to pull your phone out and open up a terminal? Yeah, 100% it is. So I would start there and tell you that those are some concerns about Sailfish OS, and I think a lot of that applies to KDE Mobile. It's great. It's a good start. I think they're well on their way, but I am a bit worried that it's going to be a bit off-putting if you come in expecting an Android or iOS-like experience, and then you're dropped into basically KDE Mobile, and you're like, well, how do I get stuff? Now, Steve, you posted a link to NTAuth, and is this what you have switched to for your 2FA?
Yeah, so I think this dovetails just a little bit here. We had talked about, was it last week that Authy no longer is supporting Graphene OS, and so on. So I started poking around. The reason why I tacked this on to this question was because previous to this, authentication is key for what I need a phone for.
Mm-hmm. It's the only thing you want a phone for, right?
Pretty much. Well, that and the actual making of phone calls. So that would have been a blocker to me previously to adopt something like Sailfish or the Ubuntu Touch or anything like that. Mm-hmm. However, NT-Auth runs cross-distro, and it also runs on Android and iOS. It's in F-Droid. It's on a bunch of the places. I've been using it for a week so far. You can also build it yourself because it's a Flutter app. And so all that to say is I really like it. I have thought that it's been very useful to me to have this back on the desktop again. And I probably am going to use it moving forward. Like it's not quite as flashy as Authy is, but it does exactly what you need it to do. And one nice benefit, it auto gets the icons, which was something that Authy didn't do. You had to pick your own icon, but like I had to jump through some hoops to get out of Authy, and part of that was like scanning QR codes. And as I scanned them, it just went and looked up the icons for all these things. So GitLab and Bitwarden and all that sort of stuff, they have their icon in the list, and I thought that was a nice touch.
That's pretty cool. Last thing I want to address is just with the whole EOS thing. I have played with it a little bit. Any of the variants, I think you'd be just fine. I'd be interested. You tell me, Jaden, what do you like about EOS that you don't like about Lineage? What would you tell somebody if they were looking for an alternative mobile operating system that you would say, here's why if I woke up in your shoes, I would encourage you to check out EOS or Murana. Why do you like that over Lineage OS?
From the Linux Newswire newsroom, this is the Week in Review with JT.
For the week of August 4th, 2024, here's the Linux and open source news. New open source code developed by researchers at the Los Alamos National Laboratory accurately simulates the performance of manufactured parts, accounting for the microstructure to make them stronger, safer, and better performing. Called Fiero, the code performs multiple multi-physics simulations, meaning it can simultaneously simulate different aspects of physical systems and their interactions across varied time and length scales. Aloha is a privacy-first mobile browser and has recently gone open source. The GCC developers have announced the release of GCC 14.2, version 2.43 of the GNU BinUtils package is out, PZip 9.9 is available, Firefox 129 has been released, Amarok 3.1 is now available and features an updated Last.fm plugin. Microsoft is promoting Azure Linux 3.0 to general availability. Ike from Serpent OS has announced the pre-alpha of the new OS. Nitrix 3.6 has been released for those who want a System D free Linux experience. And the Linux 6.9 kernel series has been marked as EOL. In open source security news, a new Linux kernel exploitation technique named Slubstick makes heap vulnerabilities more dangerous. Software cross-cache attacks, which exploit the memory reuse of the kernel allocator, can increase the impact of the vulnerability. But the TU Graz researchers noted that such attacks are still impractical, as they only have a success rate of about 40%, and they often result in the crash of the system. The activity cluster, dubbed DevPopper and linked to North Korea, has been found to have singled out victims across South Korea, North America, Europe, and the Middle East. This malware targets developers on Windows, Linux, and macOS. HackRead reports that Linux servers have been subjected to attacks with an updated version of the TG Rat Trojan, which itself is a variant of the Malix ransomware. It bypasses detection through the utilization of Telegram for its command and control. A $500 open source tool lets anyone hack computer chips with lasers. The $500 Ray V Lite relies on 3D printing, a laser pen, and a Raspberry Pi to bring costs down. In open source AI news, Apple has released its DCLM, Data Comp for Language Models, on Hugging Face. And Black Forest Labs, a team of people that helped develop the original Stable Diffusion models, has launched Flux, the largest open source text-to-image model to date. With a staggering 12 billion parameters, Flux can deliver visuals that rival those of Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, and possibly beat any other model currently available, be it open or closed source.
Steve, You have been digging into a interesting article talking about computers, BIOS, and the boot process. And as part of UEFI, there's something called Secure Boot, which basically looks for a signature from the operating system to say, hey, I'm allowed to boot. Now, the article that you were digging into was showing that researchers found hundreds of PCs sold by companies like Dell, Acer, Fujitsu, Gigabyte, HP, Lenovo, and Supermicro, and components sold by Intel have what appear to be up to 12-year-old platform keys that protect the UEFI implementation. Translation? Is really not all that secure because those keys have been deprecated, leaked, compromised in one way or the other. And these companies know that, right? And so it's not that the manufacturers don't know that they have offending PKs, but instead they just say that they put a label on it that says do not trust or do not ship. And then they continue to use and they continue to trust and they continue to ship. So my question is Secure Boot a solution in search of a problem?
I'm not convinced. We kind of talked about this in the pre-show, and Noah was making the argument that maybe it was something that someone thought up that was addressing something that we didn't actually have a problem for. I'm not convinced about that. I can see the need for protection against embedded malware, which is what you would get if you can attack the BIOS. I think that we are talking about a sophisticated state level attack or similar, right? I don't think you're going to get a random attack over the internet that's going to infect your BIOS. However, I would say that what probably happened, I have no idea, but what probably happened is they developed this for specific clients, and then they thought, you know what, this is a good thing for us to push out. Either altruistically or because it gives us another security bullet point on our list, regardless of whether it was useful to the masses, right? And so we can say Windows has this and we can announce it to the world or whatever it is, right? Because this was largely driven by Microsoft, or at least Microsoft was heavily involved in this. And so largely we're talking about a Windows audience being able to put a checkbox in terms of security. So I would buy the argument that maybe the average person didn't have a large threat vector from this, but I would say that the need probably was there. I would be surprised if they went to this effort for nothing.
Okay. So let's go with that for a moment. So let's say the average user probably doesn't have this, but in the end, if you're, especially if you're like a government agency or something like that, you want to know that it's actually Windows that's booting up and not something else. What do you say to the person who says, yeah, but Steve, my computer comes pre-shipped with a signed key from Microsoft. I'm glad that Acer and Compaq and Dell and all these other companies trust Microsoft. I don't trust Microsoft. I didn't ask for that key to be enrolled in there. I don't think that makes it secure at all. In fact, if anything, I want to see the Fedora key or the Ubuntu key, whatever it is. I want to see that key signed in there, and I want to see Microsoft stripped out of it.
It doesn't really solve the problem. Ultimately, if you can strip everybody else's out, maybe, but you have to get everybody on board in order to do that. Like if I went and replaced the key for myself, I'm either building the distro myself or I'm just taking that on from another source, right? So like if I trust Fedora, then I have to trust Fedora more than Microsoft. And as much as I don't agree with the business decisions that Microsoft makes, I don't believe that they are being malicious in their use of Secure Boot in terms of trying to do something nefarious to take over your system, or there's so many other ways that they could do this that you wouldn't find out, that they wouldn't go to this effort. Like it doesn't pass the sniff test to me, right? So having Microsoft's keys on there doesn't really bother me because I believe them to be a good enough actor that the intent is not there.
Okay, just purely for a thought experiment, not because I'm really trying to tighten my tinfoil hat on a Tuesday, but if I was to push back on that, it would look something like this. But Steve, of the companies that are out there and of the entities out there, if we know that, because I mean this is public knowledge after Snowden did what he did, we know that these companies are willing to work with governments, whereas wouldn't that be a much more difficult thing to do with the open source community? Because it would, I mean, who do you even go to say, hey, I want to sneak this thing in, or I want to get, so the threat vector is at least possible, or at least exists when you have a company like Microsoft, whereas it's blatantly, I think, a non-starter when it comes to like, an open source project where you'd have to somehow get the community to go along with it, but also hide the code enough that nobody could, I don't know, it just seems like it'd be a more difficult road to hoe.
So I like my tinfoil hat as much as the next person, and I probably wear it on the daily.
Okay.
But if
Not
I was
just on
going to
Tuesdays.
go down that route, I would say probably you should be more concerned about the BIOS manufacturers.
Okay.
You don't need Secure Boot to do this, right? Like Intel Management Engine is a thing, and it's a completely separate processor on your system running a completely different set of instruction sets that we have no idea what it's doing. Not to mention the fact that, there's a handful of BIOS manufacturers out there doing a thing, and aside from Core Boot, there really isn't an alternative to that. And even though there is Core Boot, it's not like many people are going out and ripping out the BIOS and putting in the open source BIOS. And even if they did, we don't know what other things on your system might hide that type of activity. So again, the key is if you were going to attack this and hide it, you would not hide it like this necessarily. Like there are much better ways to get this thing to sneak under the radar, areas that nobody would look. Like immediately, as soon as you attach some like Microsoft's name to something, you have a small segment of the population that gets their feelers up and starts digging into it because they sniff malintent.
Sure.
Right.
Okay, let's tell you what. Let's park the security thing for a second then. How about this? Atypical says, what about the Windows S computers where they use Secure Boot to prevent installing anything other than Windows? So in this case, they're not being a bad actor insofar as they're working with the government or trying, but what they are doing is being anti-competitive. Is that a concern for you on Secure Boot?
Are they being anti-competitive? They've developed hardware and are subsidizing the hardware.
Well, if they develop hardware and subsidize the hardware and then take technical measures to prevent you from installing anything on the subsidized hardware, by definition, that's anti-competitive.
A phone or a DVD player or a console or do you want me to go on?
I don't know that I follow the argument. So
all of those do the exact same thing. They produce hardware.
Yes.
They prevent you from doing things to that hardware other than the operating system that they ship. So Microsoft developing the Windows S for that hardware that is specifically subsidized in order to go after the lower end market is doing nothing different than a phone manufacturer, a console manufacturer, a DVD manufacturer. I mean, the DVD drive in my computer that I had to region unlock just so that I could make legitimate backups of the giant shelf of Blu-rays that I have. I had to jump through hoops just to do that because they have some sort of firmware on there that they're protecting for whatever reason.
Aaron Rainbolt in the chat room says, Secure Boot feels a bit like security versus compliance. Most of the time, the two are not the same. Very secure things can be non-compliant, and compliant things can oftentimes be easy to hack. Agree or disagree?
Sure. I don't disagree with that. You've put me in a very weird position here defending Microsoft. Like, what are you doing to me?
Sorry. I'm sorry. Well, okay, so you see a value in Secure Boot. What's the takeaway from the fact that we come out with this information that says, hey, Secure Boot in theory is great, right? In the same way, not unlike if I was to pull this full circle, right? Not unlike the CrowdStrike thing, we look back and go, does Systemd have the ability to detect a failed kernel boot and automatically roll back? It does. All of that stuff is built in. You know how many distros have that disabled by default? That's a huge problem. So technically, on the technical merits, it's solid, but the implementation sucks, and so therefore the end user doesn't really see any benefit to it. Secure Boot, the technical merits of it are great. The concept of only booting a signed operating system and forcing the user to enroll that signature so that there's a complete handoff from the time there's power provided to the computer until the time you're sitting in front of the operating system, in theory is excellent. But if we're using 12-year-old keys and those keys have been compromised, then in the end, the user doesn't benefit. What's the takeaway?
Well, I suppose the first takeaway here is that you have some 200 device models that were breached, for lack of a better way of putting it, because a single key was applied across all of them for a decade, and that key got put up on GitHub. Like, that is not the fault of the thing itself. Like,
Yes.
let's be fair about this.
It's
right?
not an implementation, or it isn't a design problem. It's an implementation problem.
Yeah, people got lazy and used the key that, the reports are saying things like the key has "don't use this," not production, "don't ship," "don't trust," actually in the key itself. Right? And so
we
but
shipped it.
people
We
shipped
trusted
it
it.
anyways. And not only did we ship it, it spread across manufacturers, and the same key. Like, the large problem here is that one key posted to GitHub somewhere breached all of these different types of devices. That's the problem. It's not the implementation of Secure Boot. It's specifically like, it's like you having an SSH key that's got no password and you post it up on the internet and then are surprised when somebody is like, "Oh, look, there's an SSH key. I'm just going to get into this computer."
Well, hold on a second. I'm not supposed to put my private SSH key up on GitLab?
You can do whatever you want, sir. You are a reasoning individual. Okay. I'm just saying.
I reasoned that it'd be easier for me to log into my own box if there was a public way for me to access my private key.
Absolutely. And I also encourage you to do that on all of your boxes and expose port 22 to the internet, as per our previous conversation, to make your life easier.
I did the first one. Everything after that, I incremented it. So the next one was 23 and 24. Nobody will figure that out. You see? So I'm safe. Safe. All right. Stockware. What is stockware?
It's stuff that gets in there that basically follows you around, right? So it's meant to hide and follow your actions, and usually it's for, most commonly people put it on phones so that they, like, your jealous ex or whatever can figure out what you're doing or where you're going and that sort of stuff.
Sounds terrible. So we have a stockware vendor and they claim that they're being breached. And so TechCrunch has handed a bunch of stolen files from a company called SpyTech that's Minnesota-based, that basically makes this software that you can install on your ex's phone or on the device or whatever. I guess I don't know for sure as a phone, but install on the device, and then it scrapes all this information out, and they got hacked. So all of that information got leaked on the internet. Am I following that correctly?
Yep, pretty much. The information goes back to as far as 2013.
So you come across all of this, you read through these articles, you're aware of this. What steps do you take on your machines? Do you nuke any of the keys from UEFI out when you buy a new machine? Do you look at it and go, meh, doesn't really fit my threat vector model because people don't have physical access to my machine? I mean, what is your takeaway from it?
I don't know that it's a good practice, so don't do like I do, but I do nuke the keys off of my BIOS.
You do. Does that make it hard to boot back into Windows? That was a joke.
No.
Okay. That was a joke. I was just kidding. Home Assistant. You've heard it mentioned on the show once or twice before. It's an absolutely fantastic piece of software if you're wanting to automate your home. It gives you a nice central place to tie all of the things together. Now, Steve, you were worried about thermals. Let me back up a little bit. Home Assistant for you isn't just a toy. For me, it's kind of like an add-on luxury that's on top of there's all the systems in the house, and then Home Assistant's kind of the glue that pulls them all together. For you, Home Assistant is absolutely mission critical. It is the thing that does all of the things. And so as your box was getting a little bit older, you were starting to worry about the thermals. Can you walk me through what Home Assistant was running on, what concerned you, and what you did about it?
So I have an Intel NUC. I forget the make and model right now. It's off because the migration has been completed, but it's circa 2017, 2018, something like that. And as time has gone on, like you said, it is the thing that is central to our house. It doesn't just do automations for the house. It also does things like sends me a notification like, go change your air filter in the furnace, dummy, because I always forget that. Like, I rely on it quite a bit. A small detour, if you'll allow me. Mm-hmm. We've been talking about, throughout the show, we've talked about how do parents deal with children or internet access and things like that.
Yes.
And my 12-year-old has been getting sneakier, and he's been hiding devices and getting on, and he somehow figured out the Wi-Fi password for one of the access points, the main one, which was a giant pain because I had to go and rotate that. And of course,
love your kid. I love it.
This is the one that the printer connects to. And of course, the way you input the printer is that old, hit the up arrow until you get to the correct, letter. And of course, I didn't think of this when I set the password. So the password is 26 or 27 characters. It's a passphrase. And pecking that out on that stupid little 1-inch screen was very maddening because you'd hit it. I had a typo and I didn't know where the typo was because you couldn't see the entire thing. So anyways, all that to say is, I've plugged it into the Unify, controller, and now it looks for the MAC addresses of the devices that he has, and it lets us know when he's gone online, regardless of which SSID he gets on, and what he does for proxies or anything like that, because somehow he had figured out how to get by the Pi-hole blocking. And so that the Pi-hole blocking wasn't specifically for him, but just I was using that to be able to track where, what network calls are going out of my network, right? And he somehow was getting around that. So I went to look up his device to see where he had been surfing and drew up nothing. So I was like, well, you know what? I'm going to hit this with a hammer. Anytime any of the devices that you have access to go online, we now get an alert. So it does, Home Assistant does the home automation. It does the reminders so that we remember to close the chickens in, shut the garage doors, whatever it is.
That's too funny, Steve.
And including, letting us know when the son has found another device to kind of squirrel away.
That's too funny. So a somewhat related thing. So as a kid, my bedroom was, it's kind of hard to explain, but basically a hallway. Think of a hallway, and you go down the hallway, and the first room on your right down the hallway was my sister's room, and you went a little further down the hallway, and the next room on the right was my bedroom, and then dead at the end of the hallway was a bathroom, which meant that one wall of my bedroom bordered the bathroom. And it just so happened that the wall that bordered between my bedroom and the bathroom is where the sink and the vanity and all that was. So I figured out at the probably around your kid's age or maybe a little younger, that if I were to, go behind my desk and kick a hole in the wall, because my wiring skills weren't great at that point, kick a hole in the wall and shove an Ethernet cable through, it would come out the wall underneath the vanity in the bathroom. And so my trick was I could go to the bathroom and hide my laptop underneath the sink and go on the internet and do what I was going to do. And if my parents ever came, I wasn't going to get in trouble for being in the bathroom. So they'd knock on the door and you almost finished? Yep, sure. Close the laptop, put it back under the sink and come back, flush the toilet, make it look like a scene, and then walk out as if nothing happened, right? And that served me well for many, many years. Fast forward to about 2 weeks ago, we were going on a trip, and two of my kids stayed at my in-laws, and then another kid came with us. And I get a call from my in-laws, and they said, look, here's the deal. We came upstairs. We told them that they had to sleep in their own rooms, and we came up and they were both sleeping together in the same room. And so we thought it was kind of cute. And so we took a picture, and it was adorable and all the things. And the next morning we asked them, so did you go because you got scared, or was it? And the kid goes, no, I didn't get scared. There was way better Wi-Fi reception upstairs than there was downstairs. So I just went to sleep with my sibling because that was upstairs and I was near the Wi-Fi. This is the world of parenting in 2024, Steve. This is what we're dealing with. We did this as kids. Well, maybe, I don't know, you strike me as more of a rule follower, but I very much was I was a rebel rouser, and now I feel like we're paying for it as parents.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that I was a rule follower so much as you didn't want to cross my parents.
Rule follower by survival.
Yes. Yep. Fly under the radar. That was my choice there. My youngest sister was like the party type person. My older sister was the let's have fun. And I figured out early on that if I didn't make a whole lot of ripples, nobody looked very closely at what I was doing.
Brilliant. Okay, that was a fun sojourn. But so bringing it back to, so you have Home Assistant. It's doing half of your parenting along with a bunch of other essential things. But you became worried that it was going to just up and die on you one day.
Yeah, I mean, like the device, like a NUC doesn't have the best thermals to begin with, and so it's gotten to the point where when we started, it wasn't doing near what it's doing right now. Like I just looked at my panel right now. It's got my calendar, it's got ESP Home, it's got Frigate, which we'll talk about later. It's got Grafana, it's got Influx, it's got Node-RED, Tailscale, and that Zigbee to MQTT. Like that's just what's down the strip of like my links menu inside of Home Assistant. Mm-hmm. And so it would get warm to the touch. Like it got warm to the touch, and it used to be that the fan would only kick on every so often. And when I'd hear it, I'd be like, oh, what's going on Home Assistant? I'll go check, right? Because that's odd. But in the last 6 or 7 months, because we've been adding more and more to it, the fan is on all the time. And that's concerning, because if this thing dies on me, even though I take backups religiously and I put them in all the places and stuff like that, it's just going to be a pain if the box actually died. So I went and grabbed another machine downstairs that I had just laying around. It's a Ryzen 1700 with a bunch of RAM in it, and like an actual MATX case and stuff like that, so that I could do good thermals. And I migrated Home Assistant over the weekend.
How'd the process go migrating, if you were to describe it to somebody who's never migrated Home Assistant before?
Well, in this case, I run Home Assistant inside of a VM. And so what my strategy was, hey, we're going to church. I'm going to write a script, and the script is going to shut down Home Assistant in the VM, transfer it over, and then when it's done, turn it back on. And so by the time we got home, nobody knew any different, because all of that stuff happened when we were away.
That's fancy. I would have just exported the config and then hope for the best as I set it back up. So you get it on the other side of this Ryzen box. What did you learn, or what did you try? Was it set up the exact same way, or did you play around with some of the underpinnings while you had the option?
Yeah. So me being me, I took the opportunity to do really silly things. Like I decided to do a bunch of benchmarking, not for power, but for power usage. So the NUC is running... it's running Ubuntu. It started its life in 1604 and has been rolled forward to, I don't know, I think it's running 2004 or something like that right now. And that was fine. And it's just running KVM on top of that. But I thought, well, I'll take the opportunity to take a peek at what the most recent Ubuntu server is and do a fresh install. So I did a fresh install and turned on Home Assistant, and then I just measured the power. And what is it doing at idle? What happens when I swap out this part versus that part? So like this machine has an NVMe, and then it has two 512 gig SATA drives that are that ZFS is putting in a mirror, and that's where the VM is living. And so I just did things like, well, what happens if I unplug one of these things? What happens if I unplug the fan? What happens if I take out the HBA controller and just use the onboard stuff?
Stress testing.
Yeah. And then I tried 3 different video cards that I had kicking around, because my thought was, and we'll talk about this in a bit about Frigate, but my thought was like, well, I could do like hardware decoding or whatever. So like, how much is this going to cost me with these different graphics cards I've got laying around?
So you started out, you did a bunch of stress testing. How about for operating systems? What did you land on?
Yeah, so I ended up, I had planned to do just a straight up migration. So my very first plan was, I'm putting Ubuntu on here. I'm just going to keep everything the same. And I actually backed off on that. So I set up Ubuntu, and I just kind of left it as the default settings. And then I moved everything over and I did my benchmarking. And during that process, I noticed that Ubuntu was slower to boot. Now, we're not talking about ages, right? It's not like it took it 3 minutes to boot. So I don't want to cast shade there. But I noticed that Snapd would have a problem shutting down, for example, or whatever. It would take a while to shut down, and then turning on, I wasn't able to identify exactly what the problem was, like why it was slower than I expected. So I thought, well, whatever. I barely ever reboot the actual host of it. And I went about trying to set this up, because this box, by default, you running Cloud Init and NetPlan and Systemd Resolved. That's how Ubuntu comes these days. And this would be an oddball of all the VMs and servers that I'm running. I didn't want to have one guy running completely different networking type stuff, because especially the Systemd Resolved has given me trouble in the past, as it spins up like a local DNS caching server. So your resolve.conf points at localhost, kind of confusingly. And when you do that, and then you can't really control which upstreams you're calling, and when, like, you can't set the order of the tertiary name servers and stuff like that as easily. So I disabled that and kind of dismantled things. And I went to try and use Network Manager and rebooted, and it just never came back up. And so I broke the networking somehow, switching from NetPlan to Network Manager, and went, well, this seems like a good time to test out the most recent version of RHEL, because, well, I work there. So I did the exact same tests on RHEL. I will say that Ubuntu was slightly more power efficient than RHEL by 2 to 3 watts in a given test. So nothing fantastic, right? But I don't know if that's due to like updated drivers or what that is. But the boot time and shutdown from RHEL was really, really quick. Like, I was shocked. I actually thought that it was still in the process of shutting down and just turned the screen off, because I did shutdown and it was like 3 seconds and it was off. And I was really, really surprised at that. So I ended up going with RHEL as my base, because I didn't have to muck around with the networking or anything like that. And I know there's going to be somebody out there that's going to write a guide for it. I'm now past it. I don't need a guide for how to fix Ubuntu's networking.
Well, to be fair, I mean, maybe you don't, but there might be somebody else that finds themselves in the same book, so or same boat. So, I mean, a guide wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, right?
No, of course not. But my main issue was I've got to have 40 or 50 VMs spread across my environment with between that and physical machines. And why would I learn NetPlan and Cloud Init for this one box? It didn't seem like a reasonable lift. And so going back to our ongoing discussion here of what is worth my time here? This didn't seem worth the time, even if it was like NetPlan could legitimately be like amazing. And I'm not being sarcastic, but at the point of like, I'm just trying to do a migration to save this box. And so I don't want to sit down and spend 7 hours trying to figure out what I want to do with NetPlan.
I will say this, as far as NetPlan goes, it is real nice to be able to open up a YAML config and just drop in a couple of things, and it just bada bing, bada boom works. That part's nice. But I agree, if you had to go really dig in, or if you're trying to customize some things, the other thing is too is the tool, right? I think the way that you couched it to me when we were chatting about this as we were going through it is like, okay, but I know this like the back of my hand, right? And I just want to know what I'm doing, and I want it to match everything else that I'm doing across the network. I don't want a special one-off snowflake.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I install Network Manager on Arch, or, name your distribution. And so it's just like, that just is, I have a series of scripts to do a bunch of all that kind of stuff, and it doesn't work with NetPlan. And so then I would have to detour.
Tell me about Frigate.
Sure. We can talk a little bit about Frigate, but I think I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about Home Assistant and getting notifications around the house, and some of the neat stuff that I'd come across this week, if you'll indulge me.
Okay.
So one of the things that's very useful about Home Assistant is the ability to know the state of a various thing. So I'll give you, for instance, we have a stand-up freezer in the garage. Sometimes, I'm not going to name names, but small people in the house don't close this properly, and that's a problem, because it's not like you go in and out of the garage all the time. So Home Assistant knows the state of the freezer door, because I have a contact sensor on it. And if it's open for more than 2 minutes, it turns the LED lights that we have on the main stairwell a color that is not normal in the house, so that you get a visual. It also sends a notification, but you get a visual cue that, hey, the freezer garage is open, right? And so I'm always kind of interested in tactile ways or visual ways of getting some sort of notification. And I understand that you were playing with stuff this weekend that could possibly help me with this.
Yeah, 100%. So there's a new product coming out. It will be essentially the way that I would describe it, an alternative to a Crestron system. So we've invited the guy who developed it to come onto the show, and more information about that. We'll have to share all of that and what he's doing. But I think it'll be a really great alternative if you're looking for controllers around your house, a way to get there and a way to be able to interact both ways, as you were saying, send commands and be able to take feedback back.
So you tell me, like, you've said, oh, we're talking about a thing, but you haven't named it or even said what you were doing with it.
I think I'm going to, unless you have I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to have him come on and talk about his own thing. And he agreed to do so. So I feel like that's probably the best way. So we'll whet the appetite a little bit, then let him come in and steal the thunder.
Sure. So needless to say, this unique thing will satisfy my needs for having an alert, but it also might be tactile, and you might actually be able to use it to interact with various automations that you might set up. So I think that might be a little bit interesting.
Tell me about Frigate. That was something that so this started back itself, right? And you were like, so if I'm not mistaken, it was the year before you looked and you were like, oh, people just find projects to hack on. I think my project this year is going to be Frigate. And so we commandeered a camera, and you brought actually some hardware to use for the Frigate server. And then we literally sit there and you sat there and cowboyed Frigate up from scratch with a bunch of us watching over your shoulder. And I understand that there's been an update in the way of what you've learned about it.
Yeah, so to back up, Frigate is an NVR, so it does network video recording for your cameras and stuff like that. And my purpose is to be able to have like always recording. So my cameras are set to record to their SD card on an event, and at the end of the event, they then ship that off via the network protocol back to my NAS. But there are times where maybe there isn't enough getting there, like the trigger isn't there. So I'll give you, for instance, we have plants on our front yard, and my wife is trying to figure out what is ruining the plants that are on the deck but are just out of the range of triggering the doorbell camera, right? So if I have this always recording, we'll solve this problem, because we have it could be deer, it could be rabbits, it could be children who just decide to not. Yesterday they walked up to the pine tree and just hacked bunches of the pine tree off just because they were, quote, pruning it. So,
because it's fun, Steve. There are ninjas, and they're hacking off the evil trees that are trying to Sorry.
Yeah. So anyways, that Frigate is going to take the place of doing that always on recording and storing it for me. And it has a nice integration with Home Assistant, which was the primary driver behind this. And honestly, the stuff at Self failed. We were not able to be successful. We got some work.
Functioned kind of.
Ish.
Yeah.
Ish. But it took a lot of work. So
and it wasn't a real great result.
Yeah. And here's the thing. I understand that documentation is hard. As somebody who writes it as part of my job, I understand that it's hard to get it lined up properly. And I also understand that there's a different methodologies for organizing your documentation. What we found was we jumped all over the place in the documentation and kind of put things piecemeal together in order to make it work, because it wasn't in the way that I was expecting it to be. And so we didn't have much success. So I thought I'd give it another shot now that I've got new hardware to put it on. Well, new old hardware, but just hardware that's sufficient to try this on. Because ultimately I did install the add-on before moving the NUC over, just out of curiosity, and it just beat the heck out of that little NUC. So just not sufficient. It didn't have the sufficient power to handle 6 cameras at 1080p. So I tried 2 different methods for this installation. So you can install the add-on directly in Home Assistant, and it launches its container, and you don't have as much control over that, because it basically takes a bunch of defaults. Then I also tried running it on the hypervisor itself. And the reason why I did that is because I only have one GPU in this hypervisor, and passing the GPU into the Home Assistant VM so that I could then try and configure it inside of a container in the VM just seemed like too much work. Like that was going to be a lot of work. So I just did it directly on the host, and I found that some very interesting results. So you would think that the GPU offloading would be more efficient.
Yes.
That was not the case. It was faster, but not more efficient. So I did multiple tests for multiple hours, and what I found was that the GPU is more power hungry. So with this Ryzen 1700, which has got 8 physical cores and 16 threads together, it would spin at, 570, 580%, looking at top. And it would draw somewhere between 85 to 97 watts, something like that, as it bounced around handling those 6 streams. When I put the GPU to task, the CPU usage dropped to like 30% from 580 or something.
Wow.
Exactly what you would think. But the wattage in the computer spiked, and it floated between 107 and 127 watts. So you're talking somewhere between 20 and 40 watts more to have the extended processing of the GPU. So for reference, this was just it was a GTX 1060. So not new, also not a super power hungry card. It made a huge difference in terms of when I was processing video files, because you can do things like, hey, give me a time lapse of this camera from this date to this date, right? You can do these sorts of things. And there was a big difference in terms of the amount of time it took to process that. But weighed against a constant drain of, let's say, 35 average watts for a thing that you might do once a day, maybe, didn't seem particularly useful. Like, it didn't seem to make a lot of sense for me, given that I'm moving from a box that was drawing 25 watts to a box that is now drawing 80 watts because I've layered yet another thing on top of it. We're basically...
And for what trade-off, right? I mean, this comes back to what you said when you first tried it. It's like, hey, I can view the live streams straight from the camera. So what am I really gaining here?
Exactly. So I ended up with a bunch of... I ran into a lot more bugs than I anticipated. And some of it was user error 100%. I absolutely had times where I was just like, oh, that was silly. Why didn't I put that information in? But I spent 2 or 3 hours kind of trolling the GitHub for various issues that they put up. And to their credit, most of the issues there are solved. And so I conquered issue after issue on the box. But I had a bunch that I haven't been able to get past, or I'm having some weird residual issues. So for example, one of the main things that you would do with your NVR would be go pick a camera and then try to go view the recordings, right?
Agreed. That's something that you would do with the network video recorder.
Right. So it gives you a nice interface for this. You can see your cameras on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, what I do like is it gives you hour chunks and then whether there was an event that happened in that hour or the number of times there was an event. So what you're supposed to be able to do is click on an hour range and then play the video from that hour. However, out of my 6 cameras, it only works on 1. And I don't know why, because they're all Reolink cameras, all using the same... I literally cut and paste the YAML configuration from the doorbell, which was the very first working camera, and I just changed some of the details. I worked on this for a long time, and I have no clue why, but I get weird error messages like, playback cannot continue, no available working or supported playlists, and all kinds of other strange errors. So I bumped into a lot of things that I wasn't able to get past. When you go to play a video, it can be extremely slow. So you click play and it swirls and it swirls and it swirls. And you're just like, what is going on here? If I pull up my file browser and click play, or even inside of Home Assistant, one of the nice things about Frigate is that it actually stores it in your media tab. So you can click on the media tab inside of Home Assistant and then just go look at your videos, right? If you do that, it plays almost instantly. But for whatever reason, when you can coax it to play, you press play and you wait and you wait and you wait. And so there's a bunch of stuff that was challenging. I went off the beaten path because why not? I tried to install this via Podman instead of Docker, and I have run into these problems before where when someone gives you a Docker Compose file, it is not easy to get GPU acceleration using Podman on a Docker Compose file, because the flags that you need to use inside of a Podman container, like running a container with Podman, don't translate one-to-one inside of a Docker Compose file. So I bumped into various things, like I had a problem where the Frigate database, which is an SQLite database, was storing the wrong time. And so when you would click on to play a video, it would pop up and say, I don't have a video for that time, because what it does is it looks first at the date, then it looks at the camera, and then underneath the camera, it stores the clips in folders via the hour. So if it's 5 p.m., it would be 1700 on as a folder, right? And what was happening would be I would click on it, and then I'd get an error saying there was no such video, but I go to the directory on the NAS, and I can see the directory, and I can see the video in the directory under the right time period. And my solution, in quotes, was I deleted the SQL database and let it rebuild itself, and it started to work, but that doesn't give you a lot of confidence. So overall, I like Frigate, and I'm gonna keep with it. But I'm a little disappointed at how many times I kind of stubbed my toe along the way.
Yeah, I have high hopes for Frigate in a couple of ways. I think we're a little ways off from replacing the commercial solutions that we put in for clients. However, I have high hopes, for the nonprofit and or budget conscious customer that says, I really just need to be able to see my cameras, and I just really need to be able to pull things up. I think it's a nice central point for them there. I also think it's super early days for Frigate, so I have some high hopes that going on, it will, over time, they will get better and better and be able to do more and more things. So I think that will be hugely beneficial to watch. And then lastly, I always tell everybody that works for me, if it isn't an open source solution, then it isn't a permanent solution. It's just a placeholder until we can find the open source solution that we're going to put into place permanently. Music in our ears means we're out of time. I thank you for joining us. We record this show every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central. You can keep up to date on the latest by following us on Twitter. I'm at Colonel Linux. He's at Linux Ovens. The show at Ask Noah Show. If you missed the show, or you want to find the articles and references we used to create the show, you can do that at podcast.asknoahshow.com. We're back next Tuesday, 6 p.m. Central. AskNoahShow.com.